May 18th, 1565. An island in the Mediterranean. 700 knights of St. John watched from their fortress walls as the horizon filled with sails. 190 Ottoman ships carrying 40,000 of the Sultan's finest warriors. The greatest invasion fleet since ancient times had come to erase this tiny island, and the Christian knights defending it from existence. The Ottomans believed it would take a week, maybe two if the knights were stubborn. After all, what could 700 men do against an empire that had conquered half the known world? What could one small island do against the unstoppable tide of Ottoman expansion that had swallowed Constantinople, crushed the Balkans, and threatened to engulf Europe itself? This is the story of Malta, the siege that saved Europe, the defense that should have been impossible, and the day when 700 knights proved that walls, faith, and courage could break an empire. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into what many historians call the most important battle of the 16th century, a siege where Christian Europe faced extinction and survived by the narrowest of margins. Because Malta wasn't just about knights and Muslims fighting over an island. It was about whether Western civilization would survive, or whether the Ottoman tide would finally sweep across the Mediterranean and drown Europe in its path. But before we get to those fortress walls, before we watch Ottoman guns pound stone and knights fight to the last man defending every inch of ground, we need to understand why this island mattered so much. Because without knowing what the Knights of St. John represented, and why Suleiman the Magnificent wanted them dead, you can't appreciate the sheer desperation of what happened when the siege finally began. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Malta. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1522, when the Knights of St. John, also called the Knights Hospitaller, were driven from their fortress at Rhodes by Suleiman the Magnificent. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were a religious military order, founded during the Crusades, devoted to defending Christianity and caring for pilgrims. They'd held Rhodes for 2 centuries, raiding Ottoman shipping, rescuing Christian slaves, and serving as Christendom's shield in the East. Suleiman crushed them at Rhodes after a 6-month siege. The knights fought brilliantly, but they were simply outnumbered. Finally, in January 1523, Suleiman offered them honorable terms. Leave Rhodes, take your weapons and wounded, and go wherever you want. Just leave. The knights, led by their Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, accepted. They sailed away, homeless warriors without a base, wandering the Mediterranean looking for a new fortress. For 7 years they wandered. Finally, in 1530, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered them Malta, a barren, rocky island between Sicily and North Africa, strategically positioned but seemingly worthless. The knights accepted gratefully. They fortified the harbors, built new defenses, and resumed their mission, raiding Ottoman shipping, freeing Christian slaves, and making Suleiman's life miserable. For 35 years, the Knights of Malta were a thorn in the Sultan's side. Their galleys would strike Ottoman convoys, capture Turkish nobles for ransom, and disappear back to Malta before Ottoman fleets could respond. They rescued thousands of Christian slaves from Ottoman galleys. They disrupted trade routes. They were, From the Ottoman perspective, pirates who needed to be exterminated. By 1565, Suleiman had had enough. He was 70 years old, nearing the end of his reign, the greatest sultan the Ottoman Empire had ever known. He'd conquered Belgrade, Rhodes, Hungary, much of the Middle East, and North Africa. He'd made the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake. But this tiny island, with its few hundred stubborn knights, remained unconquered. It was an insult. And Suleiman decided it was time to finish what he'd started at Rhodes 43 years earlier. Think about this for a moment. You're a knight of St. John in spring 1565. You know the greatest military power on earth is coming to kill you. You know they outnumber you 50 to 1. You know they've conquered everything they've ever attacked. Your choice is simple. Flee the island and abandon your vows, or stay and die defending it. Every knight chose to stay. What would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The Grand Master of the Knights in 1565 was Jean Parisot de Valette, 70 years old, a veteran of Rhodes 43 years earlier, when he'd been a young knight fighting Suleiman's first siege. La Valette was hard as stone, deeply religious, personally brave to the point of recklessness, and absolutely determined that Malta would not fall. He'd spent the previous year preparing for the inevitable Ottoman assault, strengthening fortifications, stockpiling supplies, and drilling his small garrison. Malta's defences centred on two fortresses: Fort St. Elmo, guarding the entrance to Grand Harbour, and Fort St. Angelo, the Knights' headquarters on a peninsula within the harbour. These forts were connected to the fortified town of Birgu, now Vittoriosa, where most of Malta's civilian population lived. The fortifications were strong, but not impregnable. Everything depended on whether the defenders could hold long enough for Spanish reinforcements to arrive from Sicily. La Valette's garrison numbered about 700 knights, 8,000 Maltese militia and Spanish soldiers, and several thousand armed civilians. Against them, Suleiman sent 40,000 of his finest troops, Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers who'd never been defeated, Sipahis cavalry, corsairs from North Africa, engineers, sappers, and the best artillery train in the world. The Ottoman fleet was commanded by Admiral Piali Pasha. The army was led by Mustafa Pasha, a 70-year-old veteran who'd fought at Rhodes alongside Suleiman. The Ottomans arrived on May 18, 1565. Their fleet, 193 ships, filled the horizon. Maltese watchers on the cliffs counted the banners and felt their hearts sink. This wasn't a raid. This was extermination. The Ottomans landed unopposed, established their camps, and began hauling their siege guns into position. Within days, the bombardment would begin. But first, Ottoman commanders had to decide their strategy. The logical target was Fort St. Angelo and Birgu, the Knights' headquarters, where La Valette himself commanded. But Fort St. Elmo, though smaller, commanded the harbour entrance. As long as St. Elmo held, the Ottoman fleet couldn't safely anchor in Grand Harbour. They'd have to keep their ships exposed on the open coast, vulnerable to storms. Mustafa Pasha made a fateful decision. Take St. Elmo first. It was a small fort, he reasoned, garrisoned by perhaps 100 knights and 500 soldiers. His engineers estimated it would fall in 5 days. A week at most, Then the fleet could enter the harbour safely, and the real siege of Birgu could begin. Suleiman himself had ordered that Malta be conquered quickly. The Sultan wanted it finished before summer storms made resupply dangerous. The bombardment of Fort St. Elmo began on May 24th. Ottoman artillery, some of the largest guns in the world, pounded the small fortress. Stone walls crumbled under the impacts. Defenders were killed by flying rubble. The noise was deafening, continuous, a thunder that never stopped. For hours each day, the guns roared. Then Ottoman assault troops would charge the breaches, trying to force entry. And every time the knights drove them back with sword, pike, and arquebuses fire. 5 days passed. St. Elmo still stood. A week passed, still holding. 2 weeks. The defenders, down to half their original strength, were still fighting. Mustafa was furious. His 5-day siege had become a bloodbath. Thousands of his best troops were dying in the rubble, trying to take this cursed fortress. But he couldn't stop now. Too much had been invested, too many men lost. St. Elmo had to fall. Inside the fort, the situation was desperate. The walls were breached in multiple places. The garrison was down to perhaps 60 knights and 200 soldiers still able to fight. Wounded men fought from the ramparts because there weren't enough healthy defenders. Every day, messengers swam across the harbour at night, carrying reports to La Valette. We're still here, but we can't hold much longer. La Valette faced an agonizing choice. He could evacuate St. Elmo's garrison, saving those brave men for the defence of Birgu, but that would give the Ottomans the harbour. He could send reinforcements, but that would weaken Birgu's defences. Or he could order St. Elmo to fight to the last man, buying time with their lives. Every day St. Elmo held was a day his messengers could reach Sicily, begging for Spanish relief. He ordered them to hold. On June the 23rd, after a month of siege, the Ottomans launched their final assault on Fort St. Elmo. By this point, the fortress was a pile of rubble, held by about 50 knights and 150 soldiers, most of them wounded. The Ottomans attacked with 8,000 men. The fighting was hand-to-hand, room to room, a savage melee where quarter was neither asked nor given. The knights fought to the last man. When they could no longer hold the walls, they retreated to the chapel. When the chapel was overrun, they fought in the courtyard. The last 9 knights, all wounded, made their final stand around the fort's standard. They were cut down where they stood. Every defender died. The Ottomans took no prisoners. Fort St. Elmo had fallen, but it had cost them 35 days and 8,000 casualties. Mustafa looked at the carnage and reportedly said, "If so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we pay for so large a father?" Meaning Birgu and Fort St. Angelo. Here's a question worth considering. La Valette ordered the garrison of St. Elmo to fight to the last man, knowing they'd all die, to buy time for relief. Was this brilliant strategy or a callous sacrifice? The knights who died there bought 5 weeks, enough time for messages to reach Spain, for reinforcements to be assembled. But they all died, every single one. Was it worth it? Let me know in the comments. The fall of St. Elmo unleashed a new horror. Mustafa, enraged by his losses, had the bodies of dead knights decapitated and nailed to wooden crosses, which were floated across the harbour to Birgu as a psychological weapon. La Valette's response was equally brutal. He executed all his Ottoman prisoners, loaded their heads into his cannon, and fired them back at the Turkish lines. The message was clear. This would be a war without mercy. Now the main siege could begin. On July the 15th, Ottoman guns began pounding Fort St. Angelo and the fortified towns of Birgu and Senglia. The bombardment was even more intense than at St. Elmo. Continuous artillery fire that pulverized stone, killed defenders, and made life above ground nearly impossible. The defenders retreated to underground chambers, emerging only when Ottoman assault columns approached. The Ottomans tried everything. They built a massive siege tower that could fire down into the fortifications. The knights destroyed it with a nighttime raid. They tried mining under the walls. The knights countermined, and savage underground fights erupted in the darkness as miners met miners in hand-to-hand combat beneath the earth. They tried naval assault, sending boats packed with troops to storm the walls from the sea. Maltese swimmers dove into the water and sank many boats before they could land. August came, and Malta became hell on earth. The temperature soared above 100 degrees. Men fought in full armor under the brutal sun. Water was rationed. Food was running low. Disease spread through the cramped fortifications. The stench of rotting bodies, impossible to bury properly during the bombardment, filled the air. Flies swarmed everywhere. Every day, more defenders died. But the Ottomans were suffering too. They'd been on Malta for 3 months. Their casualties were staggering, perhaps 20,000 dead already. Dysentery was killing more men than Christian swords. Supplies from Constantinople had to travel thousands of miles, and they still hadn't taken the main fortifications. The quick conquest Suleiman had demanded was turning into a nightmare. On August 7th, Mustafa launched his greatest assault. 10,000 troops, Janissaries, Sipahis, Corsairs, attacked Birgu and Senglia simultaneously. Ottoman flags briefly appeared on the walls. The knights were driven back. For a moment, it seemed Malta would fall. Then La Valette himself, 70 years old, grabbed a pike and led a counterattack. Knights and soldiers, inspired by their Grand Master fighting in the front line, surged forward. The Ottomans were driven back. The walls held. But the defenders were breaking. La Valette had perhaps 600 able-bodied fighters left from an original garrison of 9,000. The fortifications were rubble. Food was almost gone. Every day, more men died from wounds, disease, or exhaustion. The Ottomans, despite their losses, still had 20,000 troops. One more major assault would probably succeed. Everyone knew it. Then, on September 7th, 4 months into the siege, Maltese lookouts spotted sails approaching from Sicily. Spanish reinforcements were finally arriving. Only 8,000 men, but fresh troops with fresh supplies. More importantly, their arrival meant the siege would continue into autumn, when storms would threaten the Ottoman fleet. Mustafa knew his time was up. The siege had cost him half his army. Autumn storms were approaching. If he stayed much longer, his fleet might be destroyed trying to evacuate. And now Spanish reinforcements were arriving. On September 8th, the Ottomans began withdrawing. They evacuated their wounded, spiked their remaining guns, burned their camps, and sailed away. The great siege was over. The casualties tell the story of what had happened. Of the 40,000 Ottomans who landed, perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 died, killed in battle, executed as prisoners, or dead from disease. Of Malta's garrison of 9,000, only about 600 survived unwounded. Another 7,000 Maltese civilians died in the bombardments. It was one of the bloodiest sieges in history, and certainly the most important of the 16th century. The strategic consequences were immense. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, had been defeated. Suleiman the Magnificent died the following year, his last great military venture a failure. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered. Christian Europe, which had watched Malta's agony in terror, erupted in celebration. Pope Pius V declared it a miracle. Church bells rang across Christendom. For the Knights of St. John, Malta became their permanent home. La Valette, now a hero of Christendom, began building a new fortified city to replace the ruined fortifications. That city would be called Valletta, named in his honor. It would become one of the strongest fortresses in the world, its walls designed by the finest military engineers in Europe, built to ensure that Malta would never again come so close to falling. But La Valette barely lived to see his city begun. He died in 1568, just 3 years after the siege, at age 73. He'd given everything to Malta's defense: his youth at Rhodes, his middle years building the island's defenses, and his old age fighting in the breach alongside his knights. His tomb in Valletta's co-cathedral bears an inscription that captures his life. Here lies Valette, worthy of eternal honor, he who was once the scourge of Africa and Asia and the shield of Europe, whence he expelled the barbarians by his holy arms, is the first to be buried in this beloved city, whose founder he was. From a British perspective, Malta's importance would only grow. The island would pass to British control in 1800 during the Napoleonic Wars. For the next 164 years, Malta would be Britain's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, the key to controlling the sea route to India, the base from which the Royal Navy dominated the Mediterranean, and during World War II, the fortress that defied Hitler's Luftwaffe and Mussolini's Regia Aeronautica, just as it had defied Suleiman's cannon 3 centuries earlier. In 1942, Malta endured another siege, this time from German and Italian bombers that tried to pulverize the island into submission. For 3 years, Malta was the most bombed place on earth, and once again, a small island garrison held against impossible odds. King George VI awarded the entire island the George Cross, the only time in history a whole population received Britain's highest civilian award for bravery. The citation read, "To honor her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta, to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." That heroism had begun in 1565, when 700 knights refused to surrender. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the desperate sieges, the impossible defenses, the moments when a handful of warriors held against an empire, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other sieges shaped history? The defense of Vienna in 1529, the fall of Constantinople, the moments when walls were all that stood between civilization and conquest. Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.